come now to item 11, and I want to pick up the procedural point raised by Councillor Casey. I've sought advice from the Council's lawyers on this point, and they say, I'll read the advice out in full, so I'm passing it across to you without any personal input. In order to move an item into the publicly excluded part of this meeting, there would need to be both, 1, a resolution of this meeting pursuant to Standing Order 7.4.1, and 2, a ground to exclude the public pursuant to the Local Government Official Information and Meetings Act 1987. The reasons that existed to exclude the public from the Auckland Domain Committee on the 12th of April 2017 no longer apply. The reports and the resolutions from that meeting are no longer confidential.
Okay.
In relation to this report, staff have advised that there is no identifiable ground in the Local Government Official Information and Meetings Act 1987 to exclude the public. So I'm suggesting to you, councillors, that we now move on to item number 11. I'll give you the chance in just one moment, Councillor Casey. Can I just make one point, and it might be in vain, but I want to make it anyway. There will be strongly held and different views around the table on this issue, but what we are talking about is a memorial to those who sacrificed their loved ones in the First World War. And I'm asking every councillor to respect that objective in the manner in which this debate takes place. You know, I found it incredibly moving as David McGregor talked about the family that had lost their 3 sons in the war within 8 days. We are a lucky generation. We are talking about commemorating those who made the sacrifice, not just the people on the front, but the families that were there behind them that suffered those losses. And I think our debate and the manner and the tone in which we debate these issues ought to reflect that. That's not a ruling, that's a plea to decency and to common sense. Before I move the recommendation, Councillor Casey, you wanted to make a point.
Well yes. As is my right, I asked the Chair of the Domain Committee for all papers relative to today's proceedings, and one of the papers I have is a confidential memo about the cost. Are you saying that that's now in the public arena? Because if so, it's actually got to be part of this discussion.
Yep, I think, let me just seek clarification.
And that's the cost escalation.
Well, I'll come to that as a debatable point, but the costs that are set out in this paper, is there any reason why that would need to be kept confidential? Depending on the outcome of this meeting, the contract was let, and the sum that we have talked about in public, the $3 million for the project, $1 million of which has already been voted by the governing body as the ratepayer contribution, that is in the public arena already. But I just want to check your point, Councillor.
Thank you.
Could I have James, have you?
Just one moment.
Yep. Actually, maybe if I ask our lawyers to come to the end of the table, and to Ian Maxwell also, thank you. And Wayne Nicholson. We'll just wait to get some advice on that. Rob Kens, I think, is coming to the table as well. I'll just see just a few. You bear with me. If it's going to take a while, I can call a break.
My question goes to the same matter.
Yep. No, that's fine. I'm watching the body language. I think we have a result.
Your Worship, we don't know exactly which little piece of memo that...
I just don't want to put anything in the public arena.
Can you pass that to the
still got
officials, please,
confidential
Kathy?
stuff on it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Mike sent it to us.
You want to speak to that, Wayne, at the same time? While
sure.
considering it?
I mean, the other confidential item is around the Auckland Domain Committee agenda and minutes of the 12th of April 2017. I'm assuming that they're covered off by the same advice and are also no longer confidential. In
That's
which
the
case,
official advice I have in writing.
in which case, crucially, everyone here needs to have a copy of that and should have a copy of that in black and white, because it is material to our discussion.
Well, I understand from Councillor Lee that that was circulated, was it? Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah.
I don't think I've got a copy. But
Mr Mayor, I assumed, given all the publicity and given what's in this report, that the Domain Committee Officers' Report, which is what I circulated, and I think it's signed by Ian Maxwell, was no longer confidential. Be that as it may, I've circulated it to the members of the governing body, and nothing should be confidential from them anyway.
Okay, can we just have some clarity?
Yes, that's
Ian, you're
through
happy
you,
with
Your Worship.
that?
That is correct. Councillor
And-
Lee has got. And,
Legal counsel, you're happy with that? Okay.
Yes.
So let's
And what about my memo?
sorry,
Yeah.
I assumed that we'd
I
just
actually
cleared that as being okay.
So I actually feel that it's a factual memo about a revised design. I think it's fine to be.
Yep.
Fine, so we can have that circulated too.
Yep, no problem with that. Okay, can I invite Ian Maxwell
Sure.
to...
Look, thank you, Your Worship.
Oh, sorry, let me formally... I'll move the recommendations. Do I have a seconder for that? Deputy Mayor, and let's have a report from officials, then questions, and then we'll move into the debate.
Yes. So look, thank you, Your Worship. So look, Rob Cairns and I are here to answer questions, but I'll spend a few minutes just introducing the item. And it's really focusing on probably the 4 key issues that are addressed by the report if the project is to proceed as we're recommending. So the first concerns project governance. So what we're recommending here is that the governing body, yourselves, oversee the delivery of the project, but that a mayoral advisory group be established with some specific tasks around fundraising, communication and stakeholder liaison. And I'll come back to the rationale for that shortly. The second issue concerns the design and the design team. So again, we're recommending that the design Te Taku Ahi, which is that design which was endorsed by the governing body in early 2016, so a little different from the one which the memo is commenting on. So that original design proceed, and that the work be led by the company involved with that design, Rate Athfield. I've also attached some recommendations from the review of the design by Auckland Council's design panel. And I've done that because one of the issues associated with the design was around what was called a pathway or a linkage between the design and the museum or the memorial court. And so there's some comments in there from a group of experts that Council has appointed into a design panel about the validity or appropriateness of that. So I thought it would be just useful to put that in there. The third issue concerns budgeting and funding. And really the availability of adequate funding will drive whether this project proceeds. The cost of the project is estimated to be in the order of $3 million, and this is in excess of the budget we are currently holding, which is in the vicinity of 1.4. The Mayoral Advisory Group will be charged with overseeing the fundraising, so third-party funding and so forth. The project timeline provides an opportunity to come back to the governing body, and we're saying by March of 2018, and we'll be aiming for earlier than that, which will effectively be a go or no-go decision, and it will be based largely around whether we have the resources available to proceed or not. The fourth issue concerns timeframe, and obviously many of these issues are interrelated. But we are working, our target is to have this project completed by November the 11th, 2018. So that's 100 years from the time when the armistice was signed on the Western Front. It's going to be a challenge. It's not going to be easy. But we do have a couple of plan Bs in our back pocket which we can talk through with the advisory team about that date. But we think we can hit it, but it is going to be a real challenge. Key to that challenge is obtaining the necessary consents. So resource consents for this project are required. In particular, there are resource consents around earthworks. The Auckland Domain is perhaps one of the most complex regulated areas in our city. And so for this particular project, we'll need a resource consent for earthworks in a public open space, as well as in a heritage place, as well as in an outstanding natural feature. And we also think this site, certainly in the 1940s, a military camp was built on this site, and it contained a number of buildings which could have had asbestos in them. So there's the possibility of some asbestos on the site as well. So you can see the sorts of issues that we're dealing with. There's been extensive consultation to date, and obviously that's going to continue. So while the unitary plan does not require public notification, one of the issues that a judgment will need to be made on is the nature of notification. Public notification to everyone, or perhaps a more targeted or limited notification to people who live or businesses which operate from nearby. There's two other pieces of legislation which have an impact. The first is a piece of legislation that dates from a little over a century ago. So this is about development on areas adjacent to reserves, but on volcanic cones. We don't think that's an issue for this particular development, but nevertheless we'll look at that in more detail. And then finally there's the Auckland Domain Act, which actually puts an obligation on council to develop things such as public recreation, facilities, amenities, footpaths, roadways and gardens. So there's a number of pieces of interrelated legislation. So work is underway. We do need an approved design if we're going to seek or be successful in seeking funding from philanthropists, lotteries and others. So that's a summary of where we're heading. It's looking forward in terms of how we might achieve this. So Rob and I are open for questions.
Thank you very much, Ian. So let's separate questions from comments. So if there's any clarification that we need, let's go through the question aspect of this discussion first. I have a question from Councillor Casey.
Well, I'll talk through the Mayor because it's nothing personal, Ian, but given that all that stuff is no longer controversial and confidential, why was this sanitised version produced for us that entirely blames the chair of the Domain Committee for all the wrongdoings? And by that, I'll give you an example of that the Domain Committee had 8 members, some of whom are being reappointed to whatever this new body is called, and some of whom aren't. So why would you not list the resolutions which we normally do saying carried? There were no divided votes. As far as I'm concerned, there was never a division. It was a consensual body that worked through, with staff, the issues. So that's my first question through the Mayor, is why we have, in particular, 16 and 17 really, really annoy me, having read all this paperwork. It's not like that. When you put the April resolutions, it's as if the chairman decided he was going to reduce the kind of scope of the project, and because of this we're calling it in. In actual fact, there was a workshop prior to the April meeting that discussed fully the recommendations of staff, one of which was to reduce the scope of the project.
Perhaps if I can respond.
I'm happy to answer that. If I get anything wrong, you can correct me on it, Ian. Firstly, this paper is not designed to blame anyone. This paper is a paper to find a way forward. I have called it up because I received a letter from the Chief Executive that outlined the situation that we were in. The situation that we were in, and I think reflected in this paper, was one that the Domain Committee had decided it would not proceed with the original design, which was actually authorised by this body, the governing body. Secondly, as a result of disagreement between the committee and Rate Affield, who are a well-reputed designer. They did Pukeahu, they did the New Zealand War Memorial in London. They're not people that are generally regarded as other than expert in their field. They walked away. As a result of them walking away and the design changing, we were unable to proceed with the application to the Lottery Special Projects Fund for $1.5 million. As a result, a year out from the memorial year, we had no design, no designer, and insufficient money. we had spent $250,000 of ratepayers' money already on this. The Chief Executive made the call, and I was fully in agreement that we needed to come back to the governing body and try to get the project back on track, because I feared, and he feared, and staff feared, that it would not proceed. That's why it's been called up here. Let me reiterate the point again. I am not looking back, I'm looking forward to how we can get this project back on track, and the appropriate place to make that decision is this governing body. I hope that answers the question.
Well, it does, but all that information is not in this report, so...
I'm sorry?
The information
The
was
information
incorrect.
you just...
Sorry, I'm trying to listen to one councillor at a time.
Information-
Councillor Lee. Councillor Casey, you have the
This
floor.
information is contained in a letter to you from the Chief Executive. That's not in this report. So that obviously gives a greater background than paragraphs 16 and 17, which I don't have a copy of that.
I'm more than happy for you to see the letter.
Can we
but
see
I
it now
think,
then?
I think
That's obviously
that-
what prompted all of this, because the
I
call-in
think-
procedures, the bit that I'm going to spend some time on, it's not about the project itself. So I'd like to park the project over here and talk about the call-in procedure and the first-time use and how this has come about. That's what I'd like to talk about first.
I think, to be fair, the focus...
Point of order, Mr Mayor.
Point of order, Councillor Lee.
Are we questioning the officers, or are we engaged in a political debate? Because I would suggest that we complete questioning of the officers, and then we get into debating. Your response to Councillor Casey was wrong and incorrect, and departs from what is in the officers' report, which is almost by 100% accurate, but I'd like to comment on it. There are certain omissions, but your comments are dead wrong.
Well, let me just make this point. The councillor sitting beside you directed her question to me rather than the officials.
Well, I think we should go back to
I'm sorry,
the
I've got the
officials.
floor, councillor. I respected your decision to talk without interrupting, and I ask you to do the same to me and any other councillor. I answered the question because it was a genuine question and it was put to me. I am very happy that we now resume questioning to our officials. So I've got Councillor Lee, I've got you next on the list of people wanting to ask questions.
Well, I didn't intend to ask a question of the officers, but what I would, seeing Mr Maxwell is here, would he stand by the recommendations he made at that time to the Domain Committee for the 12th of April meeting, that the Domain Committee, A, request that a new simplified design be developed in line with the existing design brief, which he reminded the Domain Committee on the 12th of December, the current design brief remains paramount, which delivers an actual path within a budget of 1.4 million to be completed by November 2018, and so on. Do you stand by that advice that the committee endorsed
Looking
at that time?
At the time, and the knowledge we had, yes.
Thank you.
The issue... Oh, do you want me to continue? A fuller answer? So the issue that we have, the designers, we spent time looking at what the implications of that sort of simplified or modified design would be. First of all, we sat down with Ray Athfield to determine whether they would work and come up with a simpler design, and they walked. They did not. We then looked at working with two other design teams. One of the design teams which was involved with the original competition, and a second team which was drawn from an internal and an external source. And both of those proved problematic from a procurement perspective. So we were now running into an issue where the ability to actually deliver on time and also within budget was starting to be threatened. So that was my concern. And if I hold up my hand for failure, it's in that area. It's in failure of not highlighting more quickly the problems we were experiencing around funding, and also in assuming that Ray Athfield may be able to work in creating a simpler design, and they did not. So those are two areas which I agree are my issue and my problem.
Thank you. I didn't intend to ask a question, but thank you for that frank answer.
Right, Councillor Chris Fletcher.
Thank you. My question to Ian is around the timing of all of this, and given the significance of the domain and the revered way in which the public hold it, the importance around good process. So while I accept that there has been significant consultation on the winning design, and also that there was ongoing consultation over the design, the domain master plan, there has not been, and you alluded to it in your overview, on the earthworks that would need to be entailed. So I really just want to come to grips with this issue of notification or not,
Right.
and what that means, and the deliverability of the project. My second question, and you're welcome to answer them together, is really the timing of the project. How critical is it that the project be delivered for Armistice Day next year, when we know that for many people it's really about peace, and when we're looking at this, and the whole notion of the hearth is around those that were at home, those who were trying to keep communities continuing. It's not just Armistice, it's more than that. So is the objective of Armistice Day the right one? Would it be timely to look at perhaps the deliverability on another day that's more pertinent to those New Zealanders who were at home? I may wish to take another question following that, but I would like you to comment very specifically on the issue of notification and what advice officers have been giving.
Right. So through you, the Chair. So in terms of notification, there are two types of notification. There's what's called public notification, which essentially goes out generally, and any person can comment on it. I think the view is that that's not appropriate in this circumstance, but there is also a limited notification. So this generally targets those individuals, organisations, agencies that have an interest greater than perhaps the general public. Often, in the case of the examples you'll be familiar with, it might be the neighbours or in that sort of context. So clear examples would be the War Memorial Museum, perhaps some of the other interest groups in the area, New Zealand heritage places, things like that. And I think there's a view that in terms of limited notification, there could very well be an argument for that, and that's something that in terms of the discussion with the stakeholder liaison communication that we'll have with the mayoral advisory group, that's an issue that comes through, that we will raise. We have looked at alternative times. And there is an argument, given the nature of the memorial, that is not a memorial to the war dead, it is not a memorial to people who went overseas, it is a memorial to people who remained here and who lost loved ones overseas. That's the whole concept of the hearth. It's one of the reasons for the separation from the cenotaph and so forth at the top of the hill. There is a date where Auckland and New Zealand celebrated peace, and it took place, I think, in July or so of 1919. So that's, again, something that we could talk to, and with regards to the mayoral advisory group around timing. And actually a recommendation along those lines has been received from, in fact, the group that you heard of earlier today around the memorial or the Anzac Day ceremonies next year with Passchendaele. So that's an issue can be talked through, but we are targeting right now 2018 November.
I guess, Mr. Mayor, I personally favour 2019 and the celebration of peace as being more in keeping with this memorial, and that was going back to being an original member of the group that considered all of the entries into this design competition. That was a preference by some at that time. So I would just hate to feel that we are trying to deliver something and not giving justice to the process for a date that doesn't need necessarily to be met. So Thank you on that. I have other questions, but I'll
Please,
come.
please, councillor.
I'll come back. I'll let others take.
I have nobody else waiting to ask questions, so you're welcome to...
Oh, I've got more.
Oh, okay. Councillor Casey.
Just on it's back to the Colin matter again. I'm no slouch when it comes to standing orders, and I must admit, I didn't know where the Colin provision had come from. And I think I can speak for the rest of my colleagues around the table that it was completely out of left field, and it was one of those...
No, can't speak for me on that.
Oh, good on you, Chris. You knew about it. That's great.
Absolutely did.
It came in a report to the first business meeting of this council, where we were discussing the delegations to committees. It was at the front of that report, and I never saw it. I guess that Chris might be the only one that did. And it's a very powerful provision that allows the mayor to call in any matter. And I'm just wondering if this is just a hammer to smash a nut here, that could have been done in a different way. And I wondered if you and the chief executive discussed different ways of doing this. Because what this report does is impugn the integrity of several members, those who have been reappointed to the, whatever it's called now, congratulations, but there are several members who were both councillors and local board members who have not been reappointed, and I have no idea why that is. There's nothing in the report that tells me, and in particular the chair of the former committee has been left out entirely. There is absolutely no explanation in this report for that. So it's still wrapped up again with the call-in provision, and the way that we're doing this is for me, it's not humanitarian, it's not healthy.
Well, if I can make a brief comment, then I'll pass it across to our lawyers to give you a legal opinion. Firstly, I'm not setting out to impugn anybody's integrity, councillor. I'm setting out to try to get this project on track and delivered for the purpose for which the council, the governing body, in the last term of office, made a decision to establish it. The call-in power is set out in section 1.4 of the governing body terms of reference. This is not the first time we've used it. We used it to discuss the Westgate issue, so it's been used before, and it has been used, as far as I was concerned in utilising it, absolutely appropriately, but I'm going to ask our legal advisors to comment on whether the call-in power was appropriate in these circumstances.
Through the chair.
Anita, are you speaking
With
to
respect, I found out yesterday it's entirely appropriate. Is it morally appropriate? No, it's not.
Well, lawyers may not want to comment on
But it's
morality,
not-
but they will comment on
That's why I don't
on
really need to
law.
hear. My issue is with the way you, as the Mayor of Auckland, are doing this. And
That's a separate question. Let
None of
me-
the answers that will come from them will help me here. I think you're doing it wrong, and I think it's humiliating.
That's an opinion. I now want a legal opinion on the appropriateness of the use of this power.
Through the chair.
Thank you.
Would be inappropriate for us to comment in a huge amount of detail in a public forum, but I can confirm that we don't have any legal issues with the exercise of the Mayor's call-in power in accordance with 1.4 of the governing body terms of reference.
Thank you. Have we any further questions? Otherwise, we'll move straight to the debate.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, Councillor Mike Lee.
To the legal advisors, in terms of the call-in decision and the call-in memorandum from the Chief Executive to the Mayor, do you believe that natural justice was served by that memorandum being written and sent to the Mayor without any consultation or discussion with the affected parties beforehand? Is that good practice? Is that natural justice?
Through the chair. Again, we have no legal issue with the exercise of the mayoral call-in power, and there is no requirement in the terms of reference for the Mayor to either give reasons or to consult the committee in question when exercising the discretion as provided for in 1.4 of the governing body terms of reference.
My question was, is natural justice served by such conduct?
Illegal. Well, natural justice is at the heart of legal. The jurisprudence question.
Through the chair, it's a discretionary power in accordance with the terms of reference, so we don't see this as a natural justice issue.
Further questions? Councillor Fletcher, you had...
Yes, and Mr Chairman, I don't want to touch on the issues that are of the past question, except to say that I do really respect and have placed great reliance on the advice of Councillor Lee as we have progressed this over the last few years, and he has been a strong advocate of the need for respecting those who have served this country. So my questions don't relate to that process. It relates to looking ahead at the issue of fundraising. I'd like a little bit more detail to be provided on what the status of things is with lotteries. And secondly, I'd like you to comment, Ian, if you may, on what the fundraising appetite will be for this project, where the philanthropic community are at. Your officers, I'm sure, will have given some consideration to this, and I think as councillors we've got to be realistic around the deliverability, which is hence my questions before about timing. So could you give us a little bit of insight into where we're at with lotteries?
Sure.
And where we are, and whether any approaches have been made to any other fundraising sources?
So, through the Chair, in terms of lotteries, so lotteries have announced that they will have a, is known as a significant fund round. It will take place probably late this year or early next year. Details aren't quite resolved, but that will be a target for us. That is another round of the fund where we did not have a qualifying application for earlier this year. So that provides an opportunity to go back to lotteries. I think we need to go back in a way and explain the project and where we're at and how we're working, because obviously they've taken an interest in the proceedings here in Auckland. We've also met with the Northern Foundation and also a number of other individuals, and we've got some, and we've got some advice around perhaps contacts. But again, that's probably more appropriately spoken through with the advisory panel. So they're often individuals and they've got particular interests. So I would rather not talk about them in public here.
No, and I appreciate that. But my experience of fundraising is that it does take time. These are not things that can just click your fingers, and which again leads me to question the preference for working to an armistice day rather than a celebration of peace, which would give the luxury of an additional year to be able to make sure that all of this can be put into place in a dignified way.
I have a personal view. I think you're on the right track here, but it's at the moment we are targeting armistice. But I think the points you raise are perfectly valid, and I was planning to talk about those very issues this afternoon.
So, Mr. Chair, I reserve my speaking rights, but I would wonder whether an amendment might be possible or could be incorporated in your motion along the lines of just allowing more specifically for the amount of time that will be required to go through the fundraising processes without rushing them.
Thank you. Councillor Greg Sayers.
Thank you, Your Worship. Two questions through. The first one was just, is it correct that the Auckland Domain Committee resolved that they thought the resource consent should be publicly notified? If I could have confirmation.
That's correct.
That's correct. Okay, thank you.
Fine. Thank you.
Sorry.
Another
Sorry.
question.
That's right. And the second question was just, can you clarify for me when that committee put forward this redesign? Reading through the paper, they were going also for a smaller budget. And do you know what target budget that they were aiming for there?
That budget was the budget we were holding, which is in the vicinity of 1.4. But we would have part of that budget is a $655,000 grant from Lotteries, who provided that on the basis of the Te Taku Ahu design. So we would need to go back to Lotteries. We had made contact. the feeling was that it would be okay, but we would still have to formally go back and confirm that they were still willing to grant that money.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Kathy Casey.
It's another question for the Mayor. Has the Mayor had face-to-face meetings with the 4 people who've been dropped from this project, namely Councillor Mike Lee, Councillor Linda Cooper, Vernon Tava and Pippa Coombe of the Waitemata Local Board? And can you give me the reasons, or us, the reasons for their not being part of your new advisory group?
I have had discussions with, I think, at least 3 or 4, maybe all 4. I have had a couple of formal discussions with Councillor Lee, and I think I've given him the reason for that. On the basis of looking forward, I just want to focus on getting the project delivered, and whatever the timing might be, in answer to Councillor Fletcher, but to make sure that the investment we've already made in this project, which is $250,000, is not wasted by losing the project. There is still a prospect that the project could be lost if we weren't successful with fundraising, and the Special Projects Grant is critical to that, but critical to getting that money is having a designer and a design. This governing body has already agreed on the design, and that has now been reinforced by the Auckland Design Panel, and I want to move forward with that design.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. You didn't actually answer the question, so I'll ask it again. What was the reason that Councillor Mike Lee, Councillor Linda Cooper, board members Vernon Tava and Pippa Coombe are not part of this new advisory group?
Because I believed that to get this project back on track, we needed a fresh start, and we needed to have a group that was prepared to work with Rate Athfield, and that Rate Athfield were prepared to work with.
Do you see how this impugns the integrity of these people? Do you see how what you've just said does that? Which is what I really object to with this call-in process, because that's just not fair. And my colleague here mentioned natural justice. That's what's being breached here. Natural justice of the people who good-heartedly made decisions in good faith with staff, not feral decisions, good decisions, and now we're calling them in and pretending that it's all okay, but they're just not getting back on because what? Because what? Don't know.
Because
we need a fresh start, folks. Thanks for your 9 months, but off you go.
I think I've answered that question, but let me reiterate. I have said nothing that impugns the integrity of anyone in this discussion. We have a question from Mike Lee. Councillor.
Thank you. It's to Mr. Maxwell, and it's to go back to your memo to the Domain Committee of 12th of December, which was to assist the Auckland Domain Committee in developing a detailed brief for the design of the connection between the World War I Centenary Memorial and the Auckland War Memorial Museum. If I might, I just want to read a section from that, Section 8 of the design brief. The proposed new commemorative contemplative feature must respect, harmonise with and complement the revered Auckland War Memorial Museum as a prominent and iconic structure whose architecture, historic, cultural and community symbolism, open hilltop context and visual integrity are highly valued and protected by statutory regulation, and with the establishment of a commemorative contemplative feature beside Domain Drive and freely accessible from the existing footpath system along its edge, this brief seeks to connect the new feature or place to the War Memorial Museum using a visually recessive pedestrian linkage or way along the museum's extended central axis. And I'll leave the design brief there and I'll go to the last communication I received from Rate Athfield on the 15th of March, which states, quote, an uninterrupted actual path is counter to the concept of te takuahi, which is intended to reflect the interruption and disruption of war through its physical disruption of the museum close the actual view of the museum and of the actual circulation. And that was signed by John Rennie. Do you think there's something of a conflict with that view of Wraith Atfield and what's in the design brief?
That very issue, through you, the Chair, that issue was raised in the discussion at the Auckland Design Panel as to whether it was appropriate to have a path or not running up through from the bottom of the grassed area in front of the War Memorial. And actually the view taken was that often, particularly by members of the design panel who have been quite experienced in design competitions and so forth, that when applications are made or you've gone out to get proposals to come in, what comes in may actually be better than what had been thought at the time, writing the actual requirements of the competition. And the design, I think many of the, 3 of the 4 proposals which came in did not have a pathway linking up to the museum. And so in terms of design, I think the approach that you've received there from Wraith Atfield reflects the views of the professional designers we have in our design panel.
Mr. Maxwell, please, I asked a question about the council's official commercial design brief and whether the statements by Wraith Atfield about disrupting the domain as part of its memorial project is in conflict with the design brief. Yes, different designers are going to have all sorts of opinions, and you've quoted a group of 4. I'm talking about what the council, through a very laborious inclusive process, agreed on with stakeholders as its design brief. Do you think disrupting the domain is in conflict with the harmony and protection of the viewscapes and the symbolism of the museum in that landscape?
Well, I can't answer yes or no. It's a complex answer. Because there are a variety of things to actually achieve, and overall, our designers have said that the overall package is best achieved by not having a clear path, a footpath running up through directly to the museum.
Thank you. No more.
Okay, Councillor Wayne Walker, question.
Sure. I've got a question that goes to the risks going forward, particularly around the resource consenting issue. I'm making the assumption that the earlier Domain Committee was given some advice around resource consenting to arrive at their position that it be publicly notified. We've heard some information from you about the significance of the Munga. I don't doubt that it's an archaeological site. You've raised the issue of the Domain Act. I would have thought that if ever there was a site that had substantial public interest across many members of the public in Auckland, that this would be it. Part of my context goes to early decisions that council has made around matters to do with ports and the like, where we've been subjected to challenge and we've lost around issues that go amongst other things to notification. I appreciate that in this issue as it goes to risk, we're dealing with timelines. There's a closer timeline, there's another timeline that Councillor Fletcher has mentioned that's a little further out. But the quantum of time that could be involved in judicial review proceedings and other proceedings could be substantial, and there could be significant costs involved that could escalate the value of this project. So going to my question, I think it's imperative that we receive some information around those risks, and from my perspective, I'd like to see some legal advice, given our previous history of getting it wrong. So I just put that on the table. I don't know whether you're able to answer that now. If that's not the case, obviously there's a matter of around the urgency of this consideration or not. But for me, it's really important because this is an incredibly important location.
Okay, I think we've got the question.
So through the chair, the advice is that technically. These activities are discretionary, so they're quite low level in terms of their impact. I think if I try and put, I'm sure Councillor Lee can comment on that, I think the view taken was that, reflects some of your comments, that public notification, given the area of the domain, was important because of the domain itself. But I think from an actual consenting requirement, then then non-notification or limited notification was quite adequate, and we do have legal advice along those lines.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Kathy Casey.
Yeah, it's just on the call-up provision yet again. You mentioned, Mr Mayor, that you'd done this before with Westgate. I don't recall you revoking any decisions from Westgate at all. You called it in so that we could discuss it, and we discussed it. That's correct. This is a new departure. Sorry, it's not really a question. I know the answer, so I'll just keep going. What we've got here, though, is I think it's an abuse of the call-up provision, as I understand it, because not only are you calling it up, you're dismembering a committee and reconstituting it, but not even that, you're actually revoking all the decisions of that committee. Now, as one who has on numerous occasions tried to revoke a single resolution of a committee or the governing body, I have to get 7 signatures. 1/3 of this council has to agree with me. What you've been given is enormous power.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but this is question time. This is fine as speaking material for your contribution, but I want to focus on questions
Okay,
first,
the question is then, do you recall dismembering any committee relative to Westgate? Do you recall revoking any of the decisions around Westgate when you called it in? Do you recall that?
I think the point that I made to you, Councillor, was that I used the call-up powers for Westgate to bring it to this body to hear. It was a different set of circumstances requiring different outcomes. So I have acted differently in this respect, but the use of the call-up power is the same.
Do you believe you've got legal support for this? Do you think this is the right thing to do?
I wouldn't be doing it, Councillor, if I thought it was the wrong thing to do. Next question, Councillor Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. Following on from the earlier question, I am suggesting that delegate the decision for completion dates rather than delegate the consideration of alternative dates. So I hope that that could be considered. I'd like to ask Ian to speak to F. F is delegate to the Chief Executive responsibility for implementing the project, including responsibility for design, etc. Now, I'd like to interrogate what that actually means. Does that mean, in the implementation of a project, a decision over notification or non-notification would be the decision of the CEO, or would that still be under the oversight of the governing body and the advisory group?
So through you, the Chair. That's really a statement around actually implementing the project. So Rob here will be the project manager and staff will implement the project. And that's what's intended in terms of the transfer or the delegation to the Chief Executive of implementing the project. I personally would take the view that notification is part of this communications stakeholder program, and that's something that particularly the advisory board would make a decision on.
Thank you.
Thank you. And just on your first point, Councillor, I think both the Deputy Mayor, Cashmore and myself are happy to accept your amendment on the dates, rewording the dates. It leaves it open for us to have that discussion. I think that's important.
The other matter, and I have discussed it with you already, but under A, I felt that the inclusion of the Chair of the Auckland Domain Committee was inappropriate. And I don't see, in terms of the delivery of the project, I don't see the need for reference to the revoking delegations to the Chair of the Auckland Domain Committee as actually being helpful or certainly constructive in the deliverability of this project. Can you explain why that has to be included?
I'll ask Rob to just outline.
That simply reflects there are in previous regimes specific delegations to the chair of the committee. So we need to specifically reflect that those delegations exist, as there are similar specific delegations to the manager of the Auckland Domain. So that's just covering all the specific delegations to the people or bodies that
I
belong.
understand the delegations in and around the World War I piece, but in terms of the chair and the role that he plays with the Auckland Domain Committee, whether it's other issues relating to parking or whatever else it might be, I think something is implied there that perhaps was not intended. And I would ask that you give consideration to the removal of that revocation where it comes to the chair of the Auckland Domain Committee, because I think it's quite carefully expressed elsewhere that this is specific to the World War I Centenary Memorial and not to other activities of the Auckland Domain Committee.
So it refers explicitly to a resolution from an Auckland Domain Committee resolution that delegated to the chair of the Auckland Domain Committee and the manager of the Auckland Domain to agree the design of the connection in accordance with the design brief and any consequential changes to the memorial design. So it's to cover off that explicit delegation from the Auckland Domain Committee to the chair and the manager.
I understand your intention there, but I just feel it's somewhat clumsy in that the intention today is to bring the oversight back to the governing body. If that's the intention, I would not want to see any disrespect being applied to any, and particularly the chair of the Auckland Domain Committee.
I mean, there's no disrespect implied. It's it is procedural in the sense that, in terms of this delegation would remain on the books as the design has progressed. So the role of the governing body would be mitigated by that.
Councillors, I've got one more question, and then I'm going to just take the view of council as to whether you want to finish this debate before we break for lunch or break for lunch first. So I'm just foreshadowing that for you to think about. My last question is Councillor Mike Lee.
Thank you. Again, it's to the officers. The Mayor mentioned the sum of $250,000 that has been spent. Now, I have a document which sets out, has that figure $250,000 and attributes it to the following items of expenditure: engineer to contract, project management, archaeological, ecological, RB, cultural, erosion and sediment, stormwater assessments, resource consenting, historic places trust, i.e. Heritage New Zealand engagement, iwi engagement, CIAs, you remember them, cultural impact assessments, stakeholder engagement, QS, monitoring of physical works, quality assurance, communication and media cost. Now that is $250,000. A lot of that must have been internal council expenditure, so it would be good to try and clarify, because the committee was never given this information, up-to-date information at least. This is from last year. What has actually really been spent and what on, and how much of that is external expenditure within the council? Because when it comes to project management, one would have thought that the council is already paying a good salary for project management. So I think that needs to be clarified.
We can certainly do that as part of the process.
I mean, some of that is essential work, and some of it must be internal, but it's not particularly clear where that expenditure really is at. Thank you.
I might be able to help, Councillor, on my version of that. It's got internal staff costs $5,000. I don't know whether we're looking at the same document, but that's the information given to me. Councillors, we've reached the end of the question period. There is now the time for the debate over the recommendations. I just want a sense of whether you'd like to, rather than break into the questions and the debate, to finish the debate or whether you'd like to break for lunch. Can I get some indication?
Well, I don't think we've had a break. I don't know how long we've been
Yeah.
sitting for. So I think there's probably a number of people who would like to speak to this with good reason. So personally, I'd prefer to have a
Okay,
quick lunch
so
and then come
general,
back.
general feeling around the table? If so, let's break. I'm conscious we've got a shortage of time. Can we come back at 1:15, please? We'll resume right on the dot at 1:15.
What did Sherlock Holmes used to say? Just get into it.
I'd rather be sacked from